Costello had no clue what the city of Keene had to offer. He knew having grown up in the state didn't mean you were some sort of historian. He originally had no plans to meet or stay with family when he arrived in Manchester, but he was a new version of himself in so many ways. A text to Candace scored him a one-night stay at Uncle Blaine's house. The only thing he remembered about his uncle was he played bass in a metal band in the 90s, but never made it to the top of the charts, or even any charts. In fact, he was currently working at the same insurance company Candace worked for before the harassment lawsuit. Costello saw no shame in any of it, especially since he would have somewhere dry to sleep. The weather was getting damp, so he was pumped for old stories about Blaine's band days. Costello realized in accepting the offer from Uncle Blaine he would have no more nights alone before Maine. So yet again he shuffled his plans and found a room in Keene. Figured since he was saving the money by staying with Blaine, he had a few bucks. Plus he wasn't being entirely truthful with Avery. He was tiring, and the extra rest would be helpful. When he settled into his room, he cleaned up and went on the hunt for a decent meal. Maybe run into some chatty folks and strike up conversation about being a previous New Hampshire native. Turned out he wound up just dining alone, quietly and peacefully. Not even a word to the server or the cashier. It was as though he was still a New Hampshireite. He laughed alone as a Californian at the amount of letters and effort it took to be called a native of this state. He walked around a bit and soaked up the vibe, taking advantage of the free time he gave himself. Tomorrow is a mystery. He hasn't seen Uncle Blaine in years, so who knows what's in store. When he got back to his room, he pulled out the notes from Jenna. He shuddered a bit when he saw she planned on them visiting Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. His initial itinerary didn't have all these states. These stops were all added on the fly. Not to take a single thing away from Avery, but he knew he's altered so much of her planning. He realized how much more synced he and Jenna were when it came to processes. Avery and Costello were spontaneous and joyful. Jenna will always be more of an alloy that only came apart because of complete devastation. Costello was beginning to feel like his bond to Avery was much more fragile. As he pulled papers from a manila envelope, a card slid out. It was a card for no holiday, no birthday, no celebration. She wrote in the card for no occasion, and this was the first time he's ever seen it. Costello couldn't believe what he was reading. I would give you a card for absolutely no reason, because my feelings for you require no occasion. I don't think you yet understand what that means. I would stand in front of a train to save you for this world, because you have to offer what many can only dream. I hope to be by your side as you inspire the world with your purpose. Only you can show them what it means to be intent on conviction. Someday, you and I will fulfill our convictions, because I will be your stimulation and you will be my awakening. Costello was drenched in tears. He was miles from her in Seattle and chased the bottle around like a quipster. Knowing she put together these plans for them and he shoved them in a drawer like his tax returns made him sick. He sat on the floor and gathered himself. Was he better now than then? Could there be a way to make this positive? He couldn't wrap his head around the part where she said he would be her awakening. He wrote it off as coincidence, even though it was eerie as fuck. Jenna went home to Seattle and thankfully awoke from her coma. Was there the off chance she had visions of him or called out for him? He didn't want to be narcissistic. It was cathartic to think he may have been part of the reason she came out of her coma. On the other hand, it was absolutely shitty he was 100% the reason she wound up in a coma. He searched every piece of paper for a way he could honor her before he pedals into Maine. Costello recalled reading Nietzsche's quote. He said, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." He knows death is inevitable, but the shrewdness in this always shot up his spine. Sure, death can be unpredictable, but what if Freddy was onto something? The acts of atoning, assimilating, conforming, or evolving were conduits to personal gratitude. We can find pride in ourselves, even when we've concluded we're doing it for someone else to show validation. This keeps the spirit from rotting. Freddie was most definitely onto something. We're not all perfect, and if it takes an occasional thirst for validation to better ourselves, don't ever suffocate in that old skin. Costello was already shedding many layers, but was prepared to let another one go to honor Jenna. She deserved every bit of him sacrificing his ego. He was proud to let it all go. Curious, he was filled with anxiety while gainfully employed and coveted by the guilds of labor. Yet when he opened his heart to personal freedom and exploration, he found his way to a peaceful amalgamation. Any self-respecting nihilist says nothing changes. The truth is, nothing cannot change, and Costello would argue that point to his death. If there is nothing, then there is no change. A linguist may accept that challenge and insist nothing is simply a noun with an implied article, rather than an adverb preceding an action. A sophist may jump in just for fun to rile up the argument. Costello was sticking with the true definition of nihilism, and if there is nothing, then there would be no change. Ipso facto, since getting through this crossroad was everything, then he was there to be the change. He intended on calling Jenna's mom first thing in the morning, and then it dawned on him. It's a respectable hour in Seattle. Strike while the iron is hot. He didn't even hesitate. Costello grabbed his phone and requested it call her. He jabbed the speaker button ready to open up, and a much younger and softer voice answered. It was Jenna. It was as though Medusa stared directly into his eyes and turned him to stone. He was catatonic. Jenna spoke again. Hello? Hi. I'm sorry to trouble you this late in the evening, Costello stammered. My mom stepped outside. Give me a moment to grab her, sir, Jenna replied. Costello made time stop so he could make a critical decision. Does he keep quiet and wait for her mom, or does he just talk to her? Dozens of scenarios flew through his head as he listened to her shuffle through the house. He finally spun the wheel and waited for his instincts to take over. Jenna, he said through cellular airwaves. I'm sorry, do I know you? She replied. The shuffling stopped. For Costello, it felt as though gravity stopped. He suddenly was in a vacuum, and all motion was still. This is pretty difficult. You won't remember me. I'm a friend and very aware you're recovering from a coma. I've waited for what seems like forever to reach out to you, because I know nothing I will say could possibly make any sense. My intention was to speak with your mom, and by some semblance of good fortune, I get to hear your voice again. Costello paused, knowing he'd gone on long enough. There was a brief silence. Then he heard Jenna's mom come inside and address her. Jenna shocked Costello and asked if it were him. She called him Aaron. He heard her mom ask if she was okay. He figured if there were ever a time he would learn where he sat with the family, it would be now. Her mom waited patiently while Jenna processed the moment. Then she told Jenna she was there if she needed her. She let Jenna continue the call. My mom has spent many occasions telling me about you, about us. She's been brutally honest that she only told me the foundation and left out quite a bit. She and my father agree there are many other details that I shouldn't know until I've regained more of my memory. It took me years to understand. I don't remember anything, which I'm sorry for, but my understanding is you respected the space my family needed. And she said you were always deeply concerned. She ensured I knew how sad you are that we lost what we had. Costello responded, I'm sure you have an understanding of how special your mom and dad are, but so you know, I can attest they are absolute saints and have been as kind as anyone can be. The respect you're talking about was a difficult bridge to cross. Losing you was hard enough. Having to know you're not lost made it even harder. Costello immediately knew they've kept the details about the shooting and why she was where she was away from her. It was clearly best for him to join that front and simply enjoy the conversation. Jenna suddenly was lost for words, and Costello knew exactly why. He wasn't prepared for this moment, but he handled it perfectly. She politely asked if she could say goodbye. He smiled and obliged her, of course. He hoped she would say the words, and after another short pause, they came out. She asked if he would meet her once she became more comfortable with that opportunity. Costello expressed how much he would love that opportunity and insisted she take her time. They ended their conversation with a platonic goodbye, and just as he was about to hang up, her mom addressed him. She gave him a warm and brief message of thanks. Costello reciprocated and told her it was great to hear both of their voices. The call disconnected, and just as he heard the white noise, he realized he failed to do what he set out to do. His entire objective was to tell Jenna's mom he had made it to the East Coast and accomplished his dream. He also wanted to harangue about the notes he found written by Jenna and the states he visited, but not a word of that came out. After a few minutes, Costello knew it didn't matter. In fact, it was best none of that was even discussed. Costello laid his head down and had the best sleep he'd had since he left Los Angeles. When he woke up on Thursday, packing and prepping for the day came to him like a Marine guide handling their platoon the day before graduation of boot camp. He said goodbye to Keene, and 4 hours later he was at Uncle Bladen's house in Manchester. It was his most relaxing clip of the tour yet. He set his music to songs from his youth and took in every bit of scenery he flew by on his very expensive road bike. He must have looked down at the gift he gave himself 100 times and kept asking his younger self if he ever thought he would be here. All those hours working at the bike shop in Highland Park and reflecting on his new love of cycling. New Hampshire was this powerful reminder that everything changes. He had no interests, no hobbies, and no real purpose as a child in New Hampshire. It was one of those moments where you think about what would have become had there never been a move. Southern California gave him this new Costello. Shit, it gave him Costello. Sure, it came with a mysterious night in Seattle, but would he just be working with Uncle Blaine reviewing insurance claims had Candace not taken the promotion and transfer to the West Coast? Regardless, he was proud and thankful. He was downright happy. Making the decision to fulfill the silly, childish goal of cycling New Hampshire opened his lens so wide, he rode all the way to Manchester with a sense of pride he's never felt. The beauty of it all coasted him right up to the doorstep, where he was the perfect guest. He sadly learned Blaine was divorcing in a deep depression, however. Costello being in such a pleasant place gave Blaine a pleasant visit. This was just what he needed. They talked about Costello's tour, all the states he visited, the people he met, the cultures he experienced, and the awakening Costello had. Costello took so much pride in talking with Blaine about how much he hoped taking a stand as an amalgamist in our divisive climate would become a movement. Blaine was very apolitical and apathetic, but Costello's energy was so high, he couldn't help but take an interest. As the night grew later, Costello knew tomorrow would be his longest day in a while, and he couldn't go too deep into the evening. Thankfully, Blaine's enthusiasm began to wane, and Costello could see it, so he took his shot around 11 p.m. to call it a night. Blaine was all for it, but quickly interrupted and asked what the name Costello was all about. He gave him the abridged version of Grant's dubbing him Costello while Blaine managed a yawn and a chuckle. As he stood up and headed to bed, Blaine said, "For what it's worth, I'd stick with Aaron." Costello watched him wander off, and all he could think was that was the summation of their evening. Costello got his own chuckle and decided to have one beer. He sat alone and reflected on the last 24 hours.